The next text I'd like to look at, in light of this theme of self-examination, is part of the Hebrew wisdom tradition. This is the kind of thing that I meant when I said that self-examination could take place both on the ground level and on the sky level. Psalm 139 is very much on the sky level because it's all about the upward gaze to God. It relates to the ground level because spiritual purity and moral purity and skillful living are so tightly intertwined, and they can never be completely untwined from each other. But the tone and emphasis is very much on the explicitly spiritual, the explicitly Godward aspect. But the wisdom tradition tends to emphasize more the skillful living aspect, the ground level, which is to be done reverently under the eye of God, but isn't necessarily explicitly spiritual in terms of its subtopics. The wisdom tradition is less about making everything spiritual than it is about submitting all the mundane parts of life to the overarching divine human story and living well under the umbrella of that explanatory and meaning-making framework. In that sense, we could say that the wisdom tradition is a bit like kind of the Christian life manual of the Old Testament or the Christian psychology guide of the ancient world. And so, in that context, is where we get these two snippets of divine wisdom as relates to the mundane and practical rather than the explicitly spiritual parts of life. Proverbs 14:8. The sensible man's wisdom is to consider his way, but the stupidity of fools deceives them. Proverbs 21:29. A wicked man puts on a bold face, but the upright man considers his way. These seem, to me at least, to suggest the more practical ground level version of self-examination, the kind that's relevant for anyone, no matter what kind of life is involved. The point, I think, is to take the time and effort for careful thought rather than not to take that time and effort. The fool, it says in 14:8, will be deceived by his own stupidity, which means he thinks he's making the best choice, but his own impulses and his own unthinking proclivities are tricking him. The sensible person, by contrast, shows his wisdom by the thought and care he gives to his path or his way. This person is contemplating, you could say. This person is contemplating, you could say, the relationship between self and that which is around self in order to, by contemplation, make a more careful choice about the direction he's going. The primary difference is between showing your wisdom by your acts of inner considering or showing your lack of wisdom by being deceived by your own inner self. And while it's definitely true, we would imagine the author would see the best kind of self-examination would be done in the presence of God with the light of God shining on you. But this is the kind of self-examination that can apply not just to matters of spiritual import or relating to virtue or sin or the sacred or the spiritual, but also to matters of ground level import. Not just issues of godliness or ungodliness, and holiness or sin, but also issues of wisdom or foolishness, of living skillfully or living not quite so skillfully. Similarly, in Proverbs 21:29, the wicked man, and the wicked man throughout Proverbs is often understood to have a certain kind of foolishness that is kind of fueling his wickedness or his implacable insistence on his wicked choices. But that kind of person puts on a bold face. He's not doubting himself or rethinking his choices or examining himself. He's preferring to be confident. And this is part of how he remains wicked. This is a manifest intersection where his wickedness meets that foolishness that it's growing out of. This wicked man does not self-examine. By contrast, the upright man in this wisdom saying is characterized by considering his way. And in some translations, 21:29 and 14:8 are translated using the same English phrase, considering his way, though a more literal translation might have 14:8 saying something like understanding or analyzing your way, 21:29 saying something like directing or establishing your way. But the point remains the same. Self-examination is the kind of thing that's being used to carefully analyze and choose the path you really want to take. When I think of practical applications for these two verses, the practical applications that I tend to come to are things like either maybe a practice of journaling or a practice of carefully talking things out with someone you trust or something in that general ballpark. And the goal of that kind of thing would be, much like what we see in 1 John, would be to put some kind of light, just maybe a less explicitly spiritual kind of light in this case, but to put some kind of light over yourself and your path so that the impurities or flaws will become more visible and so that you can take a more careful step forward that'll be less likely to step on something dangerous or something less than beneficial, and which will be more likely to actually be stepping into something bright and beautiful and good rather than into the dark. This, I think I can suggest, can be thought of as another aspect of what it can mean to do truth. If you want to be someone who's doing truth instead of just doing you, it might mean taking the time to consider your way, as the wisdom writers put it. It means you recognize what kinds of careless trajectories you could take and how these are distinguished from paths that are actually good and beautiful and constructive and safe. And so you take the time to consider and choose your path with care, not just in the explicitly spiritual domain, but also in the skillful living domain. And you do this all under the reverent umbrella of the worship of God, or as the sacred wisdom tradition puts it, under the fear of God, the worshipful submission to God and awareness of the goodness that God has put in place. All right, so next, let's go up from the ground level, back up to the sky level where God is, and consider one of the really classic texts for Christian sanctification.